I too would like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands we are meeting on today and pay my deep respects to the elders past and present, pay my respects to all First Nations people who are in the room or who might be viewing this at a later date. I acknowledge the ongoing resistance and resilience of First Nations people as they fight for truth-telling and sovereignty. And indeed, it's such a privilege to speak after Ruben this morning. I too support treaty. Australia, like many other nations, has a story we tell ourselves about our character. It's a story that's rooted in notions of tolerance and inclusion, admiration for the underdog, an unshakable commitment to the fair go. Like any self-assessment of character, it pays to get a second opinion. We don't have to dig too deep to discover how this story is infused with self-serving myths, most obviously as it relates to the First Peoples of this country, but any marginalised or minority community is well placed to offer a corrective. We also in Australia like to think of ourselves as a people, as a society that values our children, that we're good at prioritising children, that we take care of them but also uphold them, support them into the adults they have the potential to be. As someone who's been in and around human rights, discrimination law, social justice, I have to admit that before this job I had a similar view. I thought of all the groups in society that we need to really get in and fight for whom we really need to recognise the structural disempowerment and disadvantage. Children, if I'm really honest, we're not high up there. It's fair to say that in the 8+ years I've been in this job seeing what I see, that view has changed. I now think that although we occasionally have a collective hand-wringing about something that's happened to children or that's happening to children, in fact we tolerate widespread and systematic breaches of their fundamental rights every single day. Even in progressive and activist circles, children's rights can be a bit of an afterthought or a bit of a niche concern, echoing a little bit of what Paula mentioned a minute ago. The experiences of children in the care system are rarely discussed in human rights conversations, in my observation. I'm very happy after this for you to tell me that I'm wrong. This has always surprised me, because when you think about it, the intrusive role of the state in the lives of children in care is pretty remarkable. The state, as parent, decides where children live, who they live with, where they go to school, what kind of access to healthcare they have, what activities they're supported to do, where they can travel, what contact they have with family, and so on. For children in residential group homes, in particular, every aspect of their daily life, right down to the food they get for dinner, is determined ultimately by the state. Children in care often feel this control. They don't, as often, as I'm going to go on to detail, feel the compassion and care that they deserve. Many feel disempowered and invisible in the system that doesn't consistently centre their views and their wishes. Today, and I'll talk in a minute about what we do at the Commission, today I'm going to draw on the work that we've done, particularly some big inquiries that we've done looking at the out-of-home care system. And for every one of those inquiries, we spend a lot of time, as you would hope and expect, hearing directly from children and young people who are in care or who have a recent care experience. For one of those inquiries, 16-year-old Kylie, who was living in residential care, said, "Kids just get left in the dark a lot. Like they just need to be kept informed what's going on with their life and that. It basically feels like you're a puppet and they're just pulling the strings." In the context of my observation, and I'm trying to be gentle and not too provocative, that children's rights, and particularly the rights of children in care, are not often a focus of human rights discussion and advocacy, I'm particularly grateful to the Castan Centre for including this as a topic in this year's conference. To my mind, there are actually few areas of public policy that warrant a human rights critique more and that get it infrequently. Very quickly about the Commission. We're an independent statutory body comprised of myself as Principal Commissioner and my very good colleague Meena Singh, the Commissioner for Aboriginal Children and Young People. The legislation that sets us up doesn't actually talk about children's rights at all. There's lots of words in there about the welfare and the wellbeing and safety of children and young people and what we have to do to promote children's interests. I and the successive commissioners for Aboriginal children I've been lucky to work with take the view that we cannot perform our legislative functions without taking a child rights approach, and so we do. There's lots of bits to our work. We regulate organisations to try and prevent and improve responses to institutional child abuse. We advocate, as you would again hope and expect, to try and get government to improve laws and policies and services that impact on children and young people. Issues like raising the age of criminal responsibility, but many, many, many more. And we also have particular oversight functions, and I'll be drawing on those today in what I share with you. Those relate to the youth justice system, not the topic for today, but could be another one at another time. Also the child protection and out-of-home care systems. We go about that oversight function in a whole range of ways. We receive every report of every incident involving a child in out-of-home care, and we review those. We can do individual inquiries. We conduct a child death inquiry whenever a child dies after being involved with child protection in the 12 months before they die. And we can also initiate what we call systemic inquiries, big reviews into aspects of the system that are particularly impacting children and young people, and we table those in Parliament. Really, I think quite a powerful tool to try and examine and expose some of the ways that these systems are impacting children and young people and their rights. Our work has progressively over time come to be shaped by and delivered in partnership with children and young people with lived experiences of the systems that we scrutinise. We are on a journey and still, I am sure, have some way to go, but over time increasingly we have worked in partnership with a youth council. We have youth engagement officers on staff now, only 2, but we'll try and find the money to build that up. We work with a much wider network of children and young people who have interest in the kinds of things that we advocate on. And I've got to acknowledge in the audience, and she's going to be on the panel later, Amelia Hunt, who's been one of our inaugural Youth Council members and who's worked with us at the Commission on a number of pieces of our work. A very strong advocate. Before I kind of talk about the care system, I just want to touch on more broadly how we go about protecting children generally. And I'm talking now about that kind of fundamental basic right to be protected from harm. For those of you who haven't dipped into it or don't know about it, last year there was a pretty significant study released, the first prevalence study that looked at the extent of childhood maltreatment in the country. Worth having a look. Amongst the younger cohort studied, it found that almost half experienced exposure to family violence, almost a third experienced physical abuse in childhood, over a quarter experienced sexual abuse in childhood, about a third experienced emotional abuse, and about 1 in 10 experienced neglect. We can no longer pretend to think that harms to children in childhood are uncommon. They are far from it. As I say, the right to life and the right to be free from cruel, degrading, inhuman treatment are amongst the most basic, widely regarded rights. The Convention on the Rights of the Child specifically recognises the importance of protecting children from physical, mental abuse, neglect and maltreatment. Unfortunately, based on what we see at the Commission, our systems are often failing to deliver even these most fundamental, traditional, protective rights. I said that we conduct child death inquiries at the Commission. In my time, we've finalised over 320 inquiries looking at the experience of children who've died after child protection involvement. When we look at those children's experiences, we see many missed opportunities, both to identify risk and what was happening for those children, and missed opportunities to put in place for that child and their family the supports that might have changed that experience. We see many children who've lived through their childhoods with multiple forms of harm, sometimes very serious harm, often over a prolonged period. They've been the subject of report to child protection again and again and again. Each one doesn't meet the threshold for intervention, which is, may or may not be appropriate. The case is closed. There's a referral to a voluntary service. The adults in that family, for all the reasons we know and understand, are not ready or able to engage with that voluntary service. Nothing changes for them. Nothing changes for that child. And there's a subsequent report with the same pattern, and again and again and again. That, I have to say, is for children whose lives we look at who have died later in their childhoods, that is the single most consistent and common pattern. The fact is, we have a really pressured child protection system. It's weighted towards crisis. We simply don't have enough prevention and early intervention supports to help families at an early point. We don't have enough of the more intensive, tailored models of support who can get in and work really effectively and supportively and consistently with families where there are complex and high needs. The practical effect of this is that many children experience repeat and significant harms if they are removed from family itself, as I'm going to go on to talk about, itself a form of harm. Often that happens after they've experienced significant long-term and prolonged exposure to harm prior. And for some, intervention comes too late. I share that because I think when you hear critiques of the care system, which I'm about to give you, it's easy to think that there's a simple answer to that, which is just stop removing children. We do have to stop removing children. Please, don't get me wrong, but we can't just do that. We can only do that whilst also investing in the kinds of services and some new service delivery models that are going to actually get in and work with children and work with their families and enable them to live safe and happy lives at home. Before I go on to talk about care, a couple of quick notes. I often take great care to be balanced. It's pretty important in a role like mine. So as part of that, of course, I acknowledge at the outset there are children and young people who do well in care, who land in incredible foster care homes or with incredible family and kinship care, who thrive, in part due to their own resilience, in part sometimes against the odds, and not due to the supports they get from the system. But the care experience, of course, is very diverse. The other part for me of being balanced when I talk is to recognise that the impacts for children and young people in this system are not by and large about the workers in the system. It's not because people work in the system and they don't care or they're taking a kind of particularly problematic approach. Often, in fact, there are incredible people doing amazing work, again against the odds. I'm going to talk today about children and young people's rights and how far from those rights we are in terms of what we deliver for them. I'm unapologetic in that focus, but behind the impacts on children, there are a whole range of significant, entrenched systemic factors. Part of my call out to you all today, and I'll come back to this at the end, is for you all to raise your awareness, your understanding of what's happening for these children, what's happening in these systems, because unless there is common attention and awareness, unless there's pressure on governments to effect some change in these systems, despite the good efforts of many good people working in services, we're not going to see the change that's needed. For those who are not familiar with the out-of-home care system, essentially it's a living arrangement for children and young people who can't live safely at home with parents. In most cases, this happens after child protection makes an assessment that a child is at risk of significant harm, and the Children's Court usually has confirmed that the child is a child in need of protection. Demand on child protection services and indeed the care system has increased over the years as awareness of different forms of harm to children, family violence, sexual abuse and so on, have grown. The number of children in care doubled between 2008-9 and 2017-18, and it's increased another 13% since then. As of last month, to give you a sense of the quantum, there were over 9,100 children in care in Victoria. Aboriginal children, when we talk about the ongoing legacy of invasion and the connection with what happened then to harms being perpetrated now, the out-of-home care system is a horrendous example. Aboriginal children are staggeringly overrepresented in these figures. That overrepresentation is growing year on year. In Victoria, 29% of the number of children in out-of-home care are Aboriginal. They're 20 times more likely than their non-Aboriginal peers to be removed from family and placed in care. And Victoria has the shameful position of being the state, the jurisdiction in Australia with the highest rate of overrepresentation of Aboriginal children in care. Children in care are mainly in 3 different care types. Again, some of you know this very well. Foster care, most people understand foster care. Foster care is a shrinking proportion of the care cohort, predominantly due to people declining or pulling out of the foster care system or not joining it as volunteers in the way and to the extent that they used to. We also have children and young people in kinship care. In Victoria, about 80% of children and young people in care are in kinship care placements, either with extended family or in kith placements or placements with other people they might know. And thirdly, we have children and young people in residential care. Victoria has relatively quite a low proportion of children in residential care, which, as you'll gather from what I go on to describe, is good. There are about 500 plus children in residential care at any given time. But this government has had a pretty clear intent to try and reduce the numbers of children in residential care. That has been a challenge. 500 children in residential care is, frankly, 500 children too many. And unfortunately, in recent years, that proportion has, the number has increased. So we've seen a 9% increase in the number of children in residential care in recent years. Children and young people in care have, by definition, experienced some kind of trauma. They have a right to be protected from harm. When children are unsafe at home, there needs to be some kind of intervention to protect them. And as a last resort, this includes removing them from their parents' care. But in doing so, if the state takes that step, it has then the responsibility to act as a good parent would. That's wording from the Children, Youth and Families Act, the relevant child protection legislation. It has a duty to meet its legal obligations to children, including, I would argue, respecting and realising their fundamental rights. I'm not going to go through all of the different instruments that set out children's rights. There's, of course, the Convention on the Rights of the Child. There are specific guidelines, UN guidelines for the alternative care of children dating to 2010. There are, within Australia, as we know, not yet a formal Human Rights Act at a federal level, but we do in Victoria have the Charter of Human Rights and Responsibilities. There's nothing specific in there for children in care, but the Charter specifically gives every Victorian child the right to protection in line with their best interests. A number of convention rights are not referenced explicitly, in the Children, Youth and Families Act, the relevant child protection legislation, but some of the concepts, including the concept that decisions should be made in children's best interests, are featured there. And then, in addition to the various legal instruments, the department that runs child protection, currently the Department of Families, Fairness and Housing, has a charter for children in out-of-home care, and that sets out a whole range of rights, some of which feature in the other instruments, some of them don't, like the right to have a worker who's there for you, the right to be able to maintain family and other connections, the right to be able to develop life skills and grow up to become the best person you can be, and the right to help preparing yourself to leave care. We all know, anyone who does any work in human rights knows that the theory of rights is all well and good. Often the reality can be very different. That is certainly true when it comes to the rights of children in care. Our various inquiries, and I do encourage you, if you're interested, to look at the Commission's website at our systemic inquiries. Certainly in the past 4 years alone, we've tabled 4 inquiries looking at different aspects of the care system. They look at a whole raft of the rights of children in out-of-home care and the extent to which they're being realised. I won't have time to talk about them all today, so I'm going to talk about a select few. The first I'm going to talk about is, again, back to that very fundamental right, the right to be protected from harm and abuse. Articles 19, 34, 39 of the Convention on the Rights of the Child describe this right. As I've said, by the time children and young people are coming into care, they've often had significant experience of trauma. Some have experienced violence and abuse and neglect before they come in. The very least they should expect is to be safe and supported to recover from that experience. In 2019, we tabled our first big inquiry into children and young people's experience in care. We called it In Our Own Words. That told us that children's safety in care was not the reality for all children. Particularly in residential care, so not exclusively. We heard from many children, too many children who had experience in foster care and kinship care, who'd experienced significant harm in those placements, but particularly for children who'd had residential care experience or who were in resi at the time, the feedback from them was stark. We didn't ask questions about safety when we spoke to over 70 children and young people who were in residential care, but most of them volunteered to tell us about the extent to which they felt unsafe, they had been threatened, or indeed they'd been subject to physical violence, emotional abuse, or some sexual abuse. One 17-year-old young person said to us, DHHS, as it was then, take us out of our parents' care for whatever reason and put us in a resi, which is just as bad. If someone's being taken out of someone's care, it's because there's been violence. You don't put them somewhere where there's more violence. It's going to cause more trauma. Another child, 16-year-old young person, also in residential care, talked about there's other resis where there are more worse kids. They don't feel like home. My first night here, a kid wanted to stab me. I never wanted to come home again. And Abigail, a 13-year-old Aboriginal young woman, said, I've not felt safe in any of my placements. I got bashed by another resident in this placement. I've never felt safe since. Now, residential care, as I've said, has about 5 to 6% of the children and young people in care. Residential care also accounts for about 80% of the reported incidents. It's not surprising that some children and young people who are placed in residential care don't stay in their placement. Children and young people tell us that they don't feel connected to their placement in residential care. It doesn't feel like home. They don't feel connection too often, to the workers, the carers who work there. And often, as I said, they don't feel safe. So they leave. They leave and they try and find connection, safety, belonging elsewhere. Sometimes with friends, sometimes with family, whether or not it's the same family that they've been removed from, sometimes with people with predatory motives. We looked at this in an inquiry that we tabled in 2021. it was called Out of Sight. It looked at the extent to which children and young people from residential care are leaving residential care, and it looked at what happens to many of them when they leave. The extent to which those children are subject to all kinds of harm, but particularly sexual exploitation, was very clear. We still see that. So every year we still receive more than 200 reports of children in residential care being the subject of victims of sexual exploitation. And what we know from the detailed work we did back in 2021, and no action's been taken to address this, we know that that extent of sexual exploitation is massively underreported. We know that for every one report of sexual exploitation of a child in care, there are another 4 incidents that are buried under another name, absent client or some other category. We're finishing an inquiry at the moment looking at one particular child's experience in care, and amongst many other failings for that child, in 3 years, that child made over 50 disclosures of sexual assault and sexual abuse in community when away from care. Each one received a woefully inadequate response from all of the agencies that should have been involved to tackle it. We've been advocating at the Commission for years now for a more proactive, coordinated, assertive approach to addressing this problem. Progress is slow. My observation is we found it in 2021 when we did massive consultations, and it's still my observation that it's easy for people from a distance to see these children and young people as troublemakers, as bad kids, quote from notes that we saw, or at least to perceive them as streetwise and savvy, and therefore not to apply to those children the degree of care and attention and intent to protect that we would expect for children in our lives, even when they've been victimised through some of the most serious offending imaginable. Moving on, I want to touch quickly on I'm going to touch on the right to health and the right to education. Of course, Article 24 of the Convention provides children the right to the highest attainable standard of health. For children in care, the United Nations guidelines mandate a particular degree of attention to their health, recognising that for children who've experienced some kind of childhood maltreatment or neglect, then their health needs are likely to be even greater than those of most children. National standards in Australia require that children entering care receive a health check within 30 days of entering care, a comprehensive health assessment within 3 months, and then that they have a health management plan. Research conducted in Victoria, not by us at the Commission, but by a doctor at the Royal Children's, Karen McLean, she found that less than 1% of children in care access the recommended health services within their first year, less than 1%. Sadly, we see some of the most devastating consequences of that in our child death inquiries. We see children who've lived with and unnecessarily suffered from serious and poorly managed medical and health issues. Tragically, on occasion, children who've died from particular conditions that haven't been properly assessed or treated. Children in care, they deserve to be safe. They also deserve access to physical health care, dental health care, as well as supports to recover from whatever they might have experienced before coming in care. We are not consistently providing that. The right to education, again, clear, articulated right in the Convention on the Rights of the Child. When we look at the Convention on the Rights of the Child, Articles 28, 29, it's clear in those words that education is not just about academic learning, it's also about the capacity to develop a child's personality and their talents and their mental and physical abilities. We know education is a key determinant of health and overall well-being and success in life. All things that students in care need as much, if not more, than their peers. And Victoria is the education state, right? We have a government that is understandably proud of the billions and billions of dollars that have been invested in building our education system in recent years. But we know, more broadly than just children in care, that the right to education is not enjoyed equally. And certainly when we looked at the educational experiences of children in care in our last systemic inquiry, Let Us Learn, that we tabled in November last year, we certainly found that children and young people in care experience significantly poorer educational outcomes and are disengaged at much higher rates than their peers. We found that over 2/3 of secondary school students in care and over half of primary school students in care are chronically absent. We found that of students in care, only a quarter make it to year 12, compared to over 80% of the rest of the student population. We found that students in care are 5 times more likely to be suspended than their peers, and that's not just young people in secondary school. We're talking about kids in prep. 3% of students in care in prep were suspended, 4% of students in year 1 had been suspended, and they're also 5 times more likely to be expelled from school. They're 7 times more likely, when we dived into the data, to be subject to restraint or seclusion at school. Now, the reasons for all of these are varied. Some of them relate to children's experiences before they come to the care system. Many relate to their experience in the care system. It's pretty hard to stay engaged at school when your placement is moved again and again and again. And a child protection system that's very focused on managing crisis finds it, we found, really hard to prioritise education. But we also find that a lot of the drivers of these outcomes are about schools and the way schools respond to children and young people in care, to a lack of consistent trauma-informed understanding in, I acknowledge, stretched classrooms, meaning that challenging behaviour, children and young people acting out, children and young people not being able to sit and focus like a good student for hours at a time, those types of things were responded to more often with punishment and exclusion than with the kinds of additional supports and understanding that might have been needed. Children and young people we spoke to for that inquiry talked about bullying and stigma from peers, and too often also from staff. They talked about negative assumptions, ideas, low expectations of their abilities amongst teachers, and an absolute lack of understanding of their care experience. Children and young people talked about the extent to which people in the school system don't understand trauma. One young person said, "Our brains are wired different because of what we've been through and how trauma has impacted us. We need more support and encouragement and less rigid regulations." Another child, 14-year-old Aboriginal child in foster care, said, "Having teachers understand that at times we've been through a lot before we've come to school, before we've even left our house. Understand that we might be going through a hard time, that we might feel suicidal, we might have a lot on at the moment." And another young person who'd been in foster and residential care said, "All teachers should have trauma training. We should have alternatives to excluding students, suspensions and expulsions. Suspensions should not be allowed. Teachers, be more human, please." I'll touch quickly on the right to culture and identity. Remember what I described at the beginning. 29% of children and young people in the care system in Victoria are Aboriginal. So everything that I'm describing in terms of the care system and its impact is disproportionately, massively disproportionately impacting Aboriginal children and young people. But of course, we know, and we heard beautifully this morning from Ruben, we know about the importance for all Aboriginal people, and particularly Aboriginal children and young people. We know about the importance of culture. We know, even if we don't often recognise it in reality, that children have a right to culture. It's reflected in the Convention. It's reflected increasingly in our domestic legislation, including in our Children, Youth and Families Act. Given the very calculated severing of First Peoples cultural ties in this country through colonisation, there are a range of quite specific legislative provisions for what the system should attend to try and minimise that breach of right to culture. That includes the system is meant to prioritise placements with kin or community, meant to have in place cultural support plans for children, meant to include involvement with Aboriginal community-controlled organisations in decision-making. In 2019, our inquiry found that Aboriginal children and young people often enter the care system at an earlier age. They're more likely to spend longer in care than non-Aboriginal children. Only 1/4 of Aboriginal children at the time were recorded as being placed with Aboriginal carers. When they were surveyed by the department, only 54% of Aboriginal children said they knew about their family background, and only half of Aboriginal children and young people who were meant to have a cultural plan had one at the time. 29%, almost a third of Aboriginal children in care who had one or more sibling in care, lived separately from them. They weren't only disconnected from both parents, but often from siblings as well. Now, our various reports, as well as the Uruk report into the child protection system, have pointed to the inability of the mainstream child protection system to consistently promote the best interests of Aboriginal children. This is an area where there has been attempts to tackle at least the disconnect from culture, both before our 2019 inquiry and since. The government has been involved in a process of transferring responsibility and funding to Aboriginal community-controlled organisations so that they can play a greater role supporting and case managing and caring for Aboriginal children in care. And increasingly, just starting now, some Aboriginal community-controlled organisations will also play a role investigating reports to child protection. So there are some ways in which Victoria is, from a very low base, leading some new approaches that seek to reflect self-determination. We heard this morning about Victoria's truth-telling processes, the treaty negotiations. These provide an opportunity to acknowledge the wounds of the practices and the policies that have atomised Aboriginal families. They give us an opportunity, we hope, to formalise a commitment to self-determination, including in the child protection and care system. I can only hope, and I have to say I was somewhat buoyed by Ruben's presentation this morning, I only hope we can see that occur, because whilst we still have the numbers of Aboriginal children in care, while we still have that staggering overrepresentation rate, we cannot pretend to be delivering self-determination in this state, not in any way. We're going to be talking in a moment at the panel about the right to participation, so I'm not going to say very much about that, only that if we think we struggle to deliver children's fundamental rights to be protected from harm, we struggle to even recognise as a concept that children have the right to have a say. Good old Article 12, the right to participate in decisions that affect them. We see in all of our work children still telling us that they're not asked what they think, what they want across myriad service settings, including child protection. In our work regulating child safe standards, organisations consistently tell me the standard they struggle with most is the standard that requires them to empower children in their organisation. It's a broader problem for us as a community than just the care system. But certainly in the care system, we hear account after account of children not getting a say in critical decisions. Critical decisions like where they live, or who they live with, or where they might go to school. Often we hear from children and young people they're not even given an explanation for what's happening and what decisions are made about them. In the interest of time, I'm just going to choose one of the children's quotes when we spoke to them about this. Caroline, who had just left care at 19, an Aboriginal young woman, I think it's like you get dropped out of the loop. But basically, we, and I don't care, we're all feeling so left out of these things, like these things are happening. We might be young, but some sort of explanation would just go a mile. And to have a say, didn't finish the sentence. Our work has found that lack of support for children's participation is partly connected to the fact that we've got a system under such stress. It's really hard to be a child in care and have voice if you don't have an allocated caseworker, which is the case for 1 in 5 children in care. It's hard to have a voice if you do have a worker, but that worker has changed 5 times in the last 3 months. Those are aspects of the care system and the child protection system that are not improving. But some of the issues are cultural. Some of them are about practice. Some of them come down to that fundamental understanding that we have of children. Are they just children to be protected and looked after? If we can just do that, I'd be happy. Or are they also beings with agency and rights to exert that agency? It's time to cut the puppet strings that leave children feeling disempowered and administered. We need to move to a care system that centres children's needs and rights and wishes and emotions. And of course, we can only do that if we ask them what they want and listen to them when they tell us. Just to close, it's my observation that we are deeply uncomfortable to acknowledge the harms that are done to children, whether that's in the home or under the watchful eye of the state, or indeed in some of our most trusted institutions. And that discomfort sometimes makes us turn away, certainly prevents us from opening our eyes and looking closely at them. Human rights gives us a really important lens through which to critique policy and practice relating to children. Human rights are an incredibly meaningful, valuable way to try and reflect our moral obligations as well as, we would hope, some legal obligations. But we need to have an honest conversation about how we too often fail children in the care system. We need to acknowledge that often we allow those children and young people to stay invisible and overlooked. We need to acknowledge that we tolerate standards of care for those children that we would never accept for children in our own families or homes or streets. For those of us who are human rights advocates and activists, we need to lean in, I think, and I'd encourage you all to do that. Look beyond issues for children and youth justice, although let's be clear, many children in care end up in youth justice. Understand, inform yourself what's happening in the care system. Find ways to advocate and raise community awareness, because it really is only if we get a broader awareness of some of these issues, only if we raise the conversation, can we have any hope at all for any government to prioritise these children and the systems that impact them. Only then can we ever hope to see a care system that upholds and delivers on children's rights. Thank you.